Evelyn Posey is a professor of rhetoric and writing studies at the University of Texas at El Paso. She's been active in the computers and writing community, writing articles and presenting papers on using technology in the composition classroom, and serving on the 4C's Computer Committee. With Kate Mangelsdorf, she's co-authored 2 developmental composition textbooks and a first-year composition textbook entitled The World of Writing, which was published by Pearson in December of 2010. Evelyn was hired into the UTEP Department of English in 1990 as a specialist in composition and rhetoric, and has since served as the chair of the department, associate dean of liberal arts, and associate vice president for academic affairs. For 5 years, she served as director of English education and director of the West Texas Writing Project, a site of the National Writing Project. She was also the recipient of a $3.4 million National Science Foundation grant for the advancement of women in science and engineering disciplines, and now serves as a consultant to universities who wish to improve the recruitment and retention of female faculty. Kate Mangelsdorf is a professor of rhetoric and writing studies and the director of university writing programs at the University of Texas, El Paso. Her research interests include critical literacies and second language writing. She has published many journal articles and book chapters and is a frequent presenter at professional conferences. Her current scholarly focus is on standard language ideologies and language demarcations. She's the principal investigator on a grant from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board that supports a major redesign of UTEP's second semester composition course and serves on the Executive Committee of the 4Cs. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona and has taught at UTEP since 1990, holding numerous administrative positions there over the course of her career, including Associate Dean of University College, Director of Developmental English, and Director of First-Year Composition. She's also the former Director of the Rhetoric and Writing Studies Program and the PhD program in Rhetoric and Composition. Thanks so much, Kate and Evelyn, for joining us today. Are you ready to begin?
We're ready.
All right, take it away.
Okay, as Amy said, today we'll be talking about multilingual writing students, opportunities and challenges, and as kind of an overview of what we'll be talking about multilingual writers in general, and then kind of a quick overview of second language acquisition. We'll be talking about who exactly are second language writing students and some specific teaching strategies to help them. We'll also be focusing on new literacies, what are new literacies, and how they can help second language students writing with furthering collaboration and acceleration. So first of all, who are multilingual writers? Traditionally, they have been international students who come to the United States from their native countries to study in American universities. They speak 2 or more languages, and they learned English in their native countries through taking ESL courses there. They are typically placed in universities in an ESOL or ESL course strand, and after they graduate they plan to leave the United States, or they might be transnational depending on their business and career interests, going to and from the United States and their native countries. But recently, because of recent demographic changes in the United States, we have had a different type of multilingual writers in our classrooms. The terminology here is kind of varied in terms of what they're often called. Sometimes they're called Generation 1.5 or U.S. resident, immigrant, heritage language students. Typically they came to the United States from their home countries with their parents around middle school age. They are typically bilingual, but sometimes just in speaking 2 or more languages. They do not self-identify as ESL students because they attended U.S. high schools. So therefore, they're usually placed into first-year composition courses in an English department, and they will remain in the United States, or if they're, say, here on the U.S.-Mexico border where Evelyn and I are, they might be transnational and kind of move back and forth from the U.S. And their home countries. So a little bit then about the terminology that we use, because it can be a little bit confusing. Typically when we say first language, a student's first language, we mean, say, Spanish or Chinese. The second language is typically, therefore, English. Often you will see the term ELL, meaning English language learner, or ESL, English as a second language. These students are bilingual, multilingual students. They speak a variety of languages and dialects. So why focus in on multilingual student writers? Two things in particular. As you all know, the world is flat, in Thomas Friedman's words, and they help us, they teach us a lot about different cultures and languages. But if we are teaching in classrooms where we have a mixture of students, monolingual English students, as well as L2 students, that's really a great situation because it helps the L1 students, the monolingual English students, learn about how languages are spoken and different cultures around the world. And very often, I think it's going to be very frequent, when all of our students in their professions and careers will be working with people from around the world. So second language acquisition, just a few words about that. It's a nonlinear process with back and forth mastery of linguistic features. So they might, for instance, master subject-verb agreement in one essay, but then you'll notice that in another essay they might make a mistake with that same type of grammatical form. And so it's kind of back and forth as they approximate the target language. They learn from their mistakes. They're going to make some errors, and then with proper feedback and correction, they will learn how to correct those errors. Also, they might have different proficiencies in different contexts. For instance, they might be very fluent when they speak English, but be less proficient in reading and writing English. Also, second language acquisition is a very gradual process. Typically, it takes 6 to 8 years of study and practice to master academic English. Now, children can pick up conversational English very quickly, but you really need a much longer period of time and a lot more exposure to the target language in order to master the more academic forms of the language. Not all skills will develop simultaneously. Some students, for instance, might be stronger in reading English as opposed to writing English. And even very fluent second language learners will have some form of accent in their writing. It could be they don't use an idiom correctly, or maybe a preposition doesn't sound right. And just as people, when they learn a second language, will speak with an accent, you're going to see some accents in second language learners' writing as well. Now, second language acquisition is also a part of identity negotiation because the language that we speak really is a part of ourself, our own identities. It shows our different cultural affiliations. We might, for instance, feel very attached to the U.S. culture, but also very attached to our home culture. We might play different roles in different languages. And it's also important to remember that English is a colonizing language for many parts of the world. And so sometimes students might resist learning English in some way or another because it has been imposed on people historically. Now, there's been a lot of research on the different writing processes that L2 writing students go through compared to L1 writing students. Compared to native English speakers, second language writers typically spend less time planning and produce shorter texts. They often will spend more time revising, however, and naturally they're going to focus more on grammar and probably worry a lot more about their writing. And very importantly, they're going to take more time to write and to read a text compared to a native English speaker. However, I want to caution us and point out that these are generalizations here, and so not all L2 writing students will be exactly like this. Also, though, L2 writing students have a lot of advantages that native or monolingual English speakers might not have. Primarily, they might have a greater metalinguistic awareness because they have studied English as a language, and so they have a greater sense of the grammatical features of English. They might be more familiar with particular grammatical terms. And they also are very used to kind of shifting roles and identities with languages, I think, which really is an excellent preparation for their professional careers, where often they will be doing that as well. Now, there's also some cultural differences to keep in mind with second language writers, but again, I want to point out that these are generalizations and will certainly not be true for all L2 writers. But some L2 writers come from cultures that are called collectivists. And this is where texts typically belong to the group rather than to a particular individual. And these cultures have much less emphasis on originality, and often they don't even have copyright laws because, again, texts belong to the community. And so students from these collectivist cultures might come into our classrooms really not understanding our concept of plagiarism or our concept of ownership of writing or of our copyright laws, and so they can inadvertently plagiarize as a result. Also, again, depending on their background, there might be some significant rhetorical differences in their writing. For instance, in U.S. English, when we write an academic essay, we're very upfront about what the essay will be about. We have a clear thesis statement and often very clear topic sentences. But in other languages, in particular the Asian languages, readers bear a lot more responsibility for understanding text. So, for instance, many Japanese academic texts might not have explicit thesis statements, and so therefore some of our students coming into our classes might be more familiar then with that rhetorical context rather than the U.S. rhetorical context. Now let us go into briefly, I think, 3 different types of teaching strategies, one on writing assignments, one on helping students with their vocabulary, and one on commenting on student writing. First of all, creating writing assignments is very important, obviously, for all students that we create clear writing assignments, but in particular for L2 writers. We want to describe our audience expectations in writing as well as just presenting it in the classroom. Explain clearly how to structure the text, maybe give a sample outline for students to follow. If it's appropriate, suggest headings and subheadings. Very clearly, again, show how to cite and how to document. Do a lot of modeling for this. Give a lot of examples of similar writing assignments that students have completed. Model, for instance, papers where a certain documentation style has been used, and carefully define your terms. For instance, we often use the term like analysis differently, and so it's important, I think, for all of our students that we make it very clear what we mean when we use a particular term. Now, second language writers are usually very, very grateful for any help that we can give them with vocabulary, because often they will know exactly how to express something in their first language, but just not have the words to say it in English. And so it's important to give a lot of examples of words and phrases that might be appropriate for a particular assignment. For instance, if you're assigning something that uses a lot of comparison and contrast, you might want to point out that they will be using terms such as on the other hand, in contrast, similarly, likewise, and so on. Again, it's important to write out particular terms in addition to simply saying them in the classroom. Let the students read the terms as well. especially if their listening skills are not perhaps as strong as some of the other students. Give a lot of examples of formulaic academic language that they might be using, such as other scholars have noted, as previous research has shown, and so on. And then refer students to a type of dictionary called an English Learner's Dictionary. And these dictionaries have many, many more examples of how a particular word is used in different contexts compared to our ordinary dictionaries, which are aimed at monolingual English speakers. And so the English Learners Dictionaries can be very helpful for students who are learning vocabulary. And then I want to talk a little bit about techniques for responding to student writing. And first of all, just as with any student writing, you want to be sure to respond to the content of the writing as well as the form, and be as positive as possible. Give constructive suggestions, but always point out what has been done well. And don't overwhelm the students with a lot of markings for errors, because it's going to be kind of a cognitive overload for them. Instead, look for error patterns and also errors that are the ones that really impede your understanding of the text, and just focus on those so that you don't overwhelm the students. Now let me talk about two different types of errors. The first type of error is usually called a treatable error, and that's a rule-governed error where you can go to a grammar handbook and look up the rule. And so, for instance, we have specific rules governing subject-verb agreement, verb tense and formation, word order in English, subject-verb-object, for instance, and which nouns can be made plural and which nouns can be made singular. For instance, the noun advice, we do not make that plural by saying advices. We simply say advice. And those are specific rules that students can look up. But there are a lot of other errors that are less treatable, and here they are really not rule-governed. They're much more idiomatic. For instance, this is word choice, particular idioms, and then always in English, prepositions and articles are very challenging for students to learn. Articles such as when do you use the, when you use a. There are some rules that govern that usage, but most of the time in English it really depends on the particular phrase that you're using. And so these errors tend to be resolved mostly by exposure to the language. Also, when you're giving feedback to student writing, there's really two different kinds. One is called direct feedback, where you are actually going into the text and providing the correction for the student. And then indirect feedback is where you are indicating that a mistake has been made, but you're asking the student to make the correction. So, what does the research show in terms of the best way to respond to second language students writers? And this research is, what I'm saying is based on the research by Dana Ferris, who teaches at the University of California at Davis, who has spent about 15 years studying the best way to respond to ESL student writing. And her research shows that grammar instruction works only if students can immediately apply it to their own writing, so that the transfer is there from a particular lesson on a particular item of grammar. Let the student apply it to their writing immediately. Also, indirect feedback, where you're indicating that an error has been made, but you ask the student to correct it, is much more effective than direct feedback on those rule-governed or treatable errors. But direct feedback, where you're actually giving the correction for the student, is much more effective for errors that are more idiomatic and not really rule-governed, such as the correct word or phrase or the correct preposition to use. Also, very importantly, make your comments as explicit and detailed as you can for the students, so that they understand exactly what it is that you're saying to them. So in general, in teaching second language students compared to teaching first language or English monolingual students, you want to provide more varied input of the target language. So for instance, you want to speak to the class about, for instance, a particular writing assignment, but be sure to put it in writing as well. You want to provide more direct modeling of languages, of language and structures, for instance, suggest specific thesis sentences or topic sentences, word groups, and focus more on vocabulary by modeling phrases and chunks of language that are very likely for students to encounter in academic texts and that they need to use in their own academic texts. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Evelyn, who will be talking to you about new literacies and second language writers.
Thank you, Kate. For my part of the presentation, I would like to add to what Kate has already been saying and talk a little bit about how instructors can use these new literacies to help second language students develop their communication skills. For my portion of the talk, then, I'll focus on the key areas that you see. What are new literacies? Why use them with second language writers? What are some of the available tools? And how are they being used to promote collaborative learning and to accelerate student progress? And of course, I'll conclude with a few tips for how we can do it better. As everyone who is listening knows, there have been many promises and disappointments in technology. In the past decades, the interactivity just wasn't there, so students and faculty often found it uninspiring, and the result was that instructors returned to what they knew worked: face-to-face instruction, tried and true in four-walled classrooms. So what is different now? Can we use new literacies defined as the ability to find, evaluate, and communicate using a wide range of text, audio, and visual resources as the foundation for building the learning communities that we envision? And what are the opportunities for our second language writers? We're all familiar with the tools of new literacies: email, instant messaging, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, web portfolios, blogs, and wikis. And for the most part, our students are familiar with them too. In fact, our students would really appreciate it if we would take advantage of them and use them more often in our classes. The usage of smart devices such as mobile phones, the iPad, and Zoom is expected to increase by 36% through 2015, with 47% of these users being 18 to 34 years old. And according to USA Today, the top 6 books sell more e-books than print versions. And as I'm sure you know, YouTube gets billions of views a day. As a result, our students have ever-increasing expectations. They would like their course content to be available on demand and to be customized, interactive, and available from multiple devices, such as their laptops and phones. To give you a specific example, one of my students came by my office to explain why he hadn't been participating much in the Blackboard discussion boards I'm teaching online this semester. And his explanation was that he couldn't remember to go to the website. And he was much more used to having everything at his fingertips on his cell phone and his iPad. And so where in the past I've been reluctant to try to deliver content to cell phones or iPads or Zooms, I think I am going to set up Facebook and Twitter to deliver those discussion board prompts, because I feel certain that students would respond right away if they received them on their cell phone. So why use these new literacies with L2 students? Kate mentioned that second language learners learn gradually in a nonlinear way, and that they learn through lots of study and practice, exposure to the target language, learning from their mistakes, and approximating the target language. The beauty of using new literacies is that communicating online gives our second language students the opportunity to do all of this and to do it 24/7. For example, in my online courses this semester, checking the Blackboard statistics, I see that my students are most often online between 11 p.m. and midnight. an hour that I'm usually asleep. So this is the opportunity for this community of student writers who are all focused on reading and communicating the same material to talk back and forth and allow for mastery of linguistic features. Of course, it provides for faster feedback from each other and from the instructor. The approximation of the target language helps the students to spot their mistakes and to correct them. I'm sure we've all had the experience of seeing a message posted to a discussion board that has second language errors in it. We respond with correct English, and then we notice that the student follows by also using correct English. So if communicating using these new literacies is so beneficial, why would we not want to use it? And I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking of the reasons now. The technology is still not available to everyone. Not all students have smartphones or even computers connected to the internet. And it can be expensive to ensure that everyone has the technology they need. Also, the rapid changes in the knowledge base and the new literacy software requires a commitment on the part of the instructors and the students to keep up with the changes. Last semester, for example, when I taught first-year composition at UTEP in a hybrid format, that is partly face-to-face and partly online, I had two returning students, middle-aged students. One of them was a second language learner, and they both admitted that they had never used a computer by choice. They had made the decision that they weren't going to get involved with the technology. So it was quite a surprise to them when they found out how much of the content was delivered via technology in the class. You can imagine the learning curve for them. And of course, there is always a lack of awareness or interest by instructors or students to use the technology. And there's the continuing perception that it creates hurdles for L2 students, that it might be more difficult for them to compose and communicate online. But if the college, the faculty, and the students have or can get the devices and the connection to the internet, then these technologies can provide a true bonus. As students write online, they not only improve their reading and communicating skills, but they gain additional cultural perspectives and experiences. And they become skilled at shifting roles and identities depending on their audiences. And they learn a lot about each other's race, gender, and class. To give you a specific example of this, these communication tools allow students to work in communities across the world. For a while now, we've used tools such as email and listservs in a single class to allow for small group interactions and online peer review as students write back and forth about class materials, post their drafts, respond to other students' writing, and then send the drafts back to the author. But more recent innovations include clustered classes, where students at one school work with students at schools across the country or even in other countries. An example of this you can see in the photograph on this slide is the Stanford Cross-Cultural Rhetoric program. This is a class or a program actually where they use video conferencing and blogs to communicate with students in classes across this country and with students living in other countries. The students in the photo there are students who are communicating with others in Egypt, Sweden, and of course the United States. The students discuss how they live, they share information about their educational experiences, and they explore their different cultural values. Divided into cross-cultural groups, these students complete communicating projects such as photo essays and brochures, all while improving and exploring the differences in their communication styles. This cross-cultural communication requires students to pay close attention to how they speak and write to ensure that they are getting their point across to all audiences, whether those students are on their own campus or across the world. The blogs provide plenty of experience for all students, but particularly second language students, to practice their communication in English. You can learn more about this project by simply Googling CCR Cross-Cultural Literacy Project at Stanford. With online blog sites such as WordPress, pictured in this slide, and wikis such as PBWiki, And social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter, opportunities abound for students and faculty to write online. The blog entry that you're seeing here is a WordPress blog that was created by one of my former students. I always ask my students to develop online portfolios of the work that they've done throughout the semester, and it's quite easy for them to do that on a blog site such as WordPress. Also, Joel Block at Ohio State University has used blogging to create a space for discussing plagiarism in a basic level L2 composition course. He argues that blogging can be an important tool for providing the students a safe place to examine such controversial issues. You may remember that Kate mentioned that there are cultural differences in the way students view documenting sources. What better way than a blog to get these out in the open, to discuss them, and to share the expectations for documentation in U.S. classrooms. In addition to collaboration in communities, online learning can also help L2 students because it provides more practice, more time to plan, more time to write and revise, and more time to edit and share. So, for example, there's online tutoring. I'm sure everyone's aware of the Purdue University OWL, but there are many other schools as well that are offering online tutoring. And these services offer extensive resources for grammar research, editing, and revising, as well as grammar exercises. And then, of course, there's Pearson's MyCompLab with integrated resources for communication. So how to do it even better? Obviously, if you're going to use the new literacies, you still need meaningful goals and objectives. It has to be clear why you're introducing something like Facebook or Twitter, and it has to make sense in the context of the course that you're teaching and the outcomes that you want to get from those students. You can learn by doing. Most of our students their expertise is much greater than ours, and they're more than happy to show us what they know about using Twitter or Facebook or a blog or a wiki. And then extensive interaction and feedback. I think probably the greatest advantage of using new literacies for our second language learners is that it does give them that opportunity to interact with other students and the instructor and to receive feedback on the writing and the reading and thinking that they're doing. There are plenty of expert models and other examples of ways that faculty have used new literacies. You can visit the 4C site, NCTE, or any of the publisher sites, and they have blogs and also other types of presentations on using new literacies in the classroom. And then most important, I think, is that we use it judiciously. Obviously, these literacies are not a replacement for good course content. So we can learn also to do it better by continuing to practice and to share our ideas in webinars like these. And so we thank you very, very much for listening to our suggestions for working with second language learners, and we'll open it now for questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate and Evelyn. Our first question is from Michelle Wagner, and this is a question for Kate. Michelle is wondering if you have the students keep error logs. Do you mark the first few treatable errors and then give a rubric suggesting further attention to respective errors?
I do use error logs, and I have found that they are really, really effective. If a student is making a lot of errors, then I will just try and get them to focus in particular errors for those error logs. But in particular, I do this a lot really for the rule-governed errors, more for the other type of errors, where I will indicate, in the margin that an error has been made, and then the student will not only have to correct the error, but then they will put it in their log, explain the rule, and then show the correction in a particular sentence. I have found that to be very effective in helping students master the grammatical features of the language.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Terry Washer, who asks about specific suggestions for others teaching freshman English online with a high number of L2 writers in the classes.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure.
We're sharing a phone receiver.
No trouble. This question is asking if you have some specific suggestions or best practices for teaching freshman English in a fully online environment with a high number of L2 learners in the class.
Well, that is what we do here, and I do teach it completely online and have enjoyed it very much. Some of the suggestions I gave in my presentation would work, and I'm trying to think where to begin to give other specific suggestions. I think obviously being sure that the students know the technology. So for example, at UTEP we use Blackboard, which I know many others use as well, and being sure that the students are familiar with that program. And then I've also discovered that giving a lot of providing a number of announcements with a lot of reiterating of the instructions and reminding students where to begin, and for example read the announcements first, then read the learning modules, then go to the discussion boards, repeating that several times, because it became apparent to me that some students are it takes them a while to get the hang of reading all parts of the course. And then reminding them if they do happen to forget a posting, or if you are using some of the new literacies, guiding them to where they can learn more about what a wiki is and how to create one, or providing that information in a resource library. Other than that, I think probably teaching the course very much as you would any first-year composition course, focusing on those same sorts of things that you know are important for all writers, and for second language writers works as well.
And that's kind of brings up a question that Jamie Miranda has posed. Maybe we could extend on the idea you were just talking about, Evelyn, where she says, what about using the same techniques for L1 students who are basic writers?
I think that would work fine. I really do like the discussion board postings and the opportunity for students to, to respond to a prompt and to get that practice writing. One of the things that I do notice with basic writers and second language writers is that sometimes they're reluctant to post because they don't feel confident in their writing abilities. So a lot of encouragement from the instructor to be sure that students are posting, and comments on the discussion board about how we're all multilingual writers and we all have our strengths and we have our weaknesses and we're all learning together. In other words, setting up an environment where people feel safe posting even if they might have some difficulty with their own writing.
Thanks. Joel Block wrote to say to thank you for mentioning his work. And,
yeah.
And then he goes on to say he's finding that he can't keep up with some of the new technologies and wonders how much space would you give students to use technologies that the teacher, him or herself, may not be familiar with?
That's a good question, because it's variable, as you know. There are students, as I mentioned, the ones in my class who had never used a computer, and then there are students who are way ahead, and certainly way ahead of where I am with technology. And so it is a constant balancing act. And I think each instructor just has to feel his or her own way and what is comfortable. For example, as I mentioned in my part of the presentation, at first I've attended conferences where people talked about delivering content to cell phones, and my first reaction was, I'm just not going there. I don't want to be communicating 24/7 with my students on my cell phone. But in talking with other instructors and also with some of my students, I discovered that students are they like that 24/7 access, but they're not going to misuse it. And you can, of course, set parameters such as I won't respond to a message after 9 p.m. or something of that sort. But I think that instructors need to stay open to the idea that students will have access to and knowledge of technologies that they would like to use, and to encourage them to go ahead and do that, even while trying to manage the course content within a framework that works for everybody involved.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kate and Evelyn, and thank you, everyone, for participating. We'll go ahead and wrap up this session now, unless Kate or Evelyn, you have something else you want to throw out there?
No, I think we're fine.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Our next session will start at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. It's titled From Blogs to Billboards to Business Memos, Teaching Reading and Composing in Multiple Literacies with Dan Melzer, and I hope to talk to you then.